My earliest memory of the Far East was it arriving in school and then bringing it home from school. All the students in the school, in the national school, had a copy of it, and it was looked forward to every month, both by us children in school because of a certain section of it dealing with children, and then when we brought it home, there were stories there from far-flung parts of the world that people had heard about, but had a special connection with because they knew somebody who was there, or they knew somebody who was there, and particularly in the west of Ireland, where you had significant numbers of people who joined the Colombians, and they had a special interest, whether it was in China or whether it was Japan or Korea or Fiji or Australia or wherever. So those parts of the world were brought home, if you like to put it that way, to the average household throughout the country. And the most important part of the whole thing was the story. It was a story that was told by this missionary or that missionary, wherever they were. And people talked about that, and people could relate to that. And particularly in the years after the Second World War, when countries were seeking independence, and Irish people had an interest in other countries seeking independence because the adult population had, it was in their memory, Irish independence and the struggle for Irish independence. So they were able to associate with others going through the same struggle. And also they were able to associate with countries which had upheavals, like for example famine or floods or drought or whatever it was, because it was part of our own history as well. So there was, if you like, there was an empathy there with all those places, and also a connection there with all those places as well. And I see it here, for example, when the volcano erupted in Mambahow in Cammington Island, where I worked. It was reported here in the Far East. Now that probably wouldn't be reported much in any other bulletin of the day, and if it was, the vast majority of people in Ireland wouldn't have heard about it anyway. But because of the connection, the Far East brought all those places and all those events right into the hearts and the heartstones of Irish life, and people had a great interest in it. And if you look at the donations that people made, for example, look at those pages there. People right throughout the country sent in small donations, but nevertheless, the small donations were a reflection of their concern for a wider world, and the Far East brought that home to them. And the same with, I suppose, the African Missions magazine as well, brought events in Africa home to them. And it was, they felt that it was part of their life, and they were contributing to the global development, if you like to put it that way, whether it was in Burma or whether it was in the South Pacific or Korea or wherever else, the Philippines, for example. And later on then it was South America. But it was that connection, in Irish life that made grave, I suppose that Irish life had a higher level of concern and a higher level of information and knowledge about far-flung places and events than probably most other developing nations at the time.
Would you have any experience of a teacher saying, commenting on the Far East?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The teacher, essentially the teacher taught geography out of the Far East because, for example, he or she would go through the events of the monthly magazine, and they would, talk about the various places from which people are writing, and they would point out those places on the map. In other words, they made a connection, not only a social connection, but they made a geographic connection, and also they made a historic connection. But the teacher of the day had the luxury of being able to do that, and had the luxury of also being able to make those connections, and also because he probably or she probably knew somebody who was there, they were able to make that connection as well. So there was a great amount of networking going on through the Far East that brought far-flung places around the world right into the hearts of Irish life.
A co-editor of the Beijing Daily said that as a child he read Pudsey Ryan.
Yeah. Yeah, it just goes to show you the reach that it had throughout the world. But I think one of the more probably important things was that it brought, say, for example, the liberation of the Philippines. For example, you take, for example, 6 or 7 Colombians lost their lives in the liberation of the Philippines. That brought it home to our area of the world, where Peter Fallon, for example, was one of the people that lost his life there. And then later on, you had the Korean War, and where Tony Collier and those other people lost their lives. And then you had my own relative, Luke O'Reilly, for example, who was in jail in China and who lived off it for the rest of his life. So we had a great connection with Luke and with that whole event, these events that were happening after the war. Like also the other thing that that people had an interest in was the development of China, I suppose. For example, the bamboo curtain and all these bits and pieces that were coming in various ways, but very limited ways, because it was either the provincial newspaper, or it was maybe the Sunday newspaper, or it was the Far East. And only then when radio came along were people able to relate to a lot of these issues as well.
Yeah, the Colombian Far East writers, they were on the ground in the area.
Yeah, they were on the ground in the area. And also the pictures that was here, like for example, you have pictures here of MacArthur coming ashore at the liberation of the Philippines. They were pictures that stuck in my mind anyway, from the Far East, that these images stay there, and they're still there. I mean, that's as vivid today as it was in 1945 or 46 when it happened, in my memory. And also it was interesting too, when I was in Camaguin Island, for example, having read about Camaguin Island and the explosion of the volcano in 1948, 49, 50, 51, to go there and see the thing there in front of me smoking every morning, for example. And also the other events that was for example, when people were expelled from China, and the imagery of these people coming out of China, like Bishop Galvin, and people who were in poor health and all that kind of thing. The people
Bishop
of Ireland,
Cleary, yeah.
The people of Ireland were able to relate to that because of the Far East. And also, for example, you have the picture here of Bishop Cleary coming out of the train with the bag. I remember that's vivid in my mind, and I'm sure it's vivid in an awful lot of Irish people's minds as well.
The different themes and topics that the Far East dealt with over the years, and the new trends, I suppose, post-Vatican Council,
Yeah.
the new era being ushered in.
I suppose the Far East, for example, documented the world post the First World War, and in that also it documented the rising independence of nations. For example, what was there when the Colombians went to China were empires, but gradually after the First World War, independence movements began to spring up, and then again after the Second World War, those independence movements began to bear fruit, and it essentially gave people an insight into history, and people talked about these places as if they had been there. You know, listening to people talk about Hong Kong or Shanghai or Manila or some of those places, in my childhood anyhow, the people talked about it as if they had been there. And they were getting all that from the Far East, and it was then, I suppose, if you like to put it that way, in the 1950s, with the development of Europe and also the development of the Second Vatican Council, essentially what happened in my mind anyway was the end of an era, from Columbus to Castro, the end of an era of conquest, and the whole idea of mission began to take a different viewpoint. For example, mission was affected up to that point and later on through mission institutions like our own. But then the Second Vatican Council came along and said the church's mission, the church is in the world to serve the world. So the church saw itself not just institutes, but the church itself was mission. So how did the Far East relate to that? And it did relate to that by all the kind of stories and documentation that went on down through the years with regards to third world development and the whole issues that came into political, social, economic and cultural change that happened there and the tensions that happened as a result. And also all this was reported, like for example Korea was reported. Korea was a very poor country in up to 1962, 3, 4, 5 and maybe longer. And then all that development that happened in Korea was reported as well here. And it was an area in which we had a close connection with, because we had lost, Ireland had lost its people there, just the same as they had lost people in the Philippines, just the same as we had lost chaplains in the Second World War in France and other places as well. So but all these things were reported, brought home and brought into Irish households, and people felt that because they knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, or because they gave a donation, or because they were the Far East, that they were part of this part of global movements.
Would you see it as a flagship going on?
It's very hard to know in the modern era how this can be reinvented, but I think that one of from my reading, for example, with regards to Irish migration, with regards to migration from different parts of the world, what people are looking for is a story. What people are looking for is a story that has a certain amount of analysis and a certain amount of explanation, and also that they can relate to people who are working there, whether it's in lay mission or whether it's in clerical mission. And also I think one of the things that the Far East has to take up is a whole new concept of ministry, because in my opinion anyway, the European model of ministry that has emerged out of monasticism is not going to be able to relate to ministry in the modern conurbations, like for example Santiago or Manila, or all these places which have 15, 20, 30 million people. In other words, and I think this is something that the Far East, or the Columban information, whether it's the Far East or how it's presented, has to begin to question, is it possible for the kind of mission that we were associated with is going to be relevant as it is now into the future in all these big conurbations throughout the world. In other words, is there something, and the Far East has highlighted this down through the years, that for example we have one priest, for example, for about 1,000 people here in Europe, and the church and the administration of the church sees nothing wrong with one priest for 30 or 40,000 in South America or someplace else. Are we still operating with the colonial mindset? Now hopefully the Far East will lead us out of a colonial mindset and lead us into new arenas of mission, whether it's in or urbanization, or whether it's in migration. And also the other thing is that the modern Far East documents quite a lot of modern migration, because in actual fact the modern day migrants, they are the evangelizers, whether we like it or not. How many new churches have started here in Ireland, how many new mosques, how many new temples, and the same throughout the world. So therefore a lot of people are maybe pessimistic of the fact that our numbers have fallen, and the numbers in other institutes like our own have fallen. That mission is not going on. Evangelization is going on all the time, because you have people going from place to place, just as it happened right down through the centuries, whether it was in conquest, whether it was in the trade routes, or in whatever way it happened. People brought the message of the gospel to places that we only imagine today.